current over-incarceration and corrections involvement of Indigenous peoples has been a concerning problem for a number of decades due to the effects of colonialism. The impact of over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples also socially impacts their communities, which can lead to them missing out on employment and education opportunities. The BC First Nations Justice Council is a group of 7 appointed Indigenous directors that aim to support the well-being of future Indigenous generations. The Council works on behalf of First Nations peoples in BC in legal matters and strives to bring impactful change to the legal system. It is an evolving model of justice that endeavors to transform the status quo, upholding self-determination, reclaiming legal traditions, and addressing systematic injustice. The Council has potential to address this problem. It focuses on the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples through addressing policing, judiciary, and the programs and services within prisons. The colonial and biased judicial system currently in place has substantially contributed to the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous representation within the judiciary system creates an environment of oversight for the fairness and well-being of Indigenous peoples, and more importantly, it is an attribute of decolonization. This view is shared by Elizabeth Argentini, a professor at the University of Victoria, where she states, "Validating Aboriginal conceptions of justice and empowering Aboriginal people through their involvement in the administration of justice is an important step towards their decolonization." The BCNJC has and continues to work diligently to address Indigenous representation within the current legal system by re-establishing an Indigenous legal system approach that focuses on the cultural healings of Indigenous peoples. There is a bias and racist culture that exists in the courts that attributes to the important decisions that transpire within the legal system. A really important question was asked by Margaret Boll-Corvia, who holds a PhD in social psychology. As she states, "The evidence is overwhelming that racial disparities in criminal justice exist, raising the question of what is the best method for eliminating them. Addressing a bias and racist culture directed at Indigenous people within the judicial system is an imperative step towards their safety and well-being as they go through the legal system. Bias and anti-racist training for the lawyers, Crown Counsel, and the court system would substantially benefit Indigenous peoples in the areas of sentencing, early release times, and for their overall well-being. Re-establishing an Indigenous legal system that consists of Indigenous courts and an Indigenous prosecution policy allows for ancestral legal traditions to thrive once again, giving Indigenous people the cultural healings to regain their place back into an Indigenous way of being." The common colonialist ideology that police use when engaging with Indigenous people has been a contributor to the over-incarceration of Indigenous youth and adults. There has been a history of cultural systematic racism within police culture. Establishing a better approach through enhanced policing could be substantially beneficial for the well-being and safety of Indigenous peoples. The BCFNJC advocates for more Indigenous control over community policing, establishing a better relationship with law enforcement, and working together for the underlying goal of trust and public safety within Indigenous communities. By implementing new Indigenous training programs for police officers and establishing better control over local policing, the relationship and trust in Indigenous communities with police can be established in a positive way with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous communities have had a long history of racism with municipal police and the RCMP due to the racial profiling and Indigenous discrimination practices associated with colonialism. A sociology professor, Lin Quinn Cao, states, "Democratic racism in policing harms the relationship between the police and Aboriginal people. Confidence in police is crucial to establishing a trusting relationship that would allow for Indigenous communities to have more positive interactions and better non-racist outcomes with law enforcement. There needs to be Indigenous representation within police departments and/or Indigenous police services established within Indigenous communities to acquire that trust. Having an established trust in law enforcement allows for Indigenous communities to work closely together with law enforcement in crime prevention and helps establish better crime prevention programs. First Nations must be able to support Indigenous peoples within the corrections system. The BCF-NJC wants a system in place for the tracking of Indigenous inmates' movements for the purpose of helping the connection take place between communities and its members. This initiative would establish a bond between inmates and community that would lead to better healing practices and beneficial outcomes. Training improvements and education needs to be put in place, focusing on training correctional staff in order to diminish the bias culture currently in place. Having Indigenous programs in place would greatly be beneficial for the safety and well-being of Indigenous inmates and would allow them to reclaim their Indigenous identity and also would allow for proper integration back into their communities. Integrating Indigenous programs and services into jails is one of the key elements in the healing and reclaiming of self-cultural identity among incarcerated Indigenous peoples. The colonialist system has systematically diminished most aspects of Indigenous culture. This is why a resurgence of Indigenous self-awareness is an imperative step in the right direction for the healing of incarcerated Indigenous peoples. By addressing racial bias among correctional staff, it creates a safe place for inmates. Also, when you change the racial perceptions of people, that perception carries back into their communities as well. Allowing a culturally safe space gives Indigenous inmates the space they need to culturally heal. By having Indigenous programs such as these allows the BCF-NJC to actively pursue better outcomes. Colonialism has systematically broken down the cultural identity of many Indigenous peoples. The loss of language, culture, and ancestry, combined with multi-generational drug, alcohol, poverty, racism, physical and mental abuse, has contributed deeply to the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples. There is a movement to heal Indigenous peoples from many of these horrific and traumatizing lived Indigenous experiences. This movement focuses on reclaiming an Indigenous way of being with an ancestral Indigenous legal system that allows and supports its members to find their way back into their communities so they can reestablish a strong, proud, and prosperous Indigenous way of knowing, living, and being. This movement matters because without such a movement, colonialism will continue to thrive within Indigenous communities and the legal system. And many more Indigenous people will continue to be culturally lost forever.